The sun hung low over the horizon of the Third Reich in early 1944, casting long, jagged shadows across the concrete runways of an airfield near Magdeburg. Major Heinz Bahr, an ace with over 200 victories, climbed into the cramped cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190. For years, the Luftwaffe had owned these skies. They had swatted away the unescorted B-17s and outmaneuvered the heavy P-47s that were forced to turn back at the German border. But today, the air felt different. As Bahr climbed to 30,000 feet, he looked toward the west and saw something that shouldn't have been there. Small silver specks, glinting like diamonds against the deep blue of the stratosphere. They weren't turning back. They weren't low on fuel. They were deep inside Germany, and they were moving with a predatory grace that made the veteran pilot's blood run cold. In that moment, Bahr realized the war had changed. The little friends had arrived, and they weren't going home until the Luftwaffe was dead. This is the story of the P-51 Mustang, told not by the men who flew it, but by the German pilots and engineers who lived in its shadow. To understand the impact of the Mustang, one must first understand the supreme confidence of the German Luftwaffe in the early years of the war. To the engineers at Messerschmitt and Junkers, the American aviation industry was a sleeping giant that lacked the refinement of European design. When the first reports of a new American fighter, the XP-51, reached Berlin in 1940, the reaction was one of mild curiosity rather than concern. German intelligence noted that the aircraft had been designed and built in just 102 days for the British. To the disciplined, methodical minds in Augsburg, such haste suggested a lack of quality. They looked at the early Mustang's Allison engine and saw a power plant that wheezed at high altitudes. It was a low-level tactical scout, they concluded. It was no threat to the high-flying Bf-109. But as the war ground on, the German technical departments began to notice a disturbing trend. The Americans were not just building planes, they were iterating at a pace that defied logic. In the testing hangars at Rechlin, German engineers finally got their hands on a captured P-51B. They walked around the airframe with a mixture of professional respect and growing dread. What they saw was a masterpiece of aerodynamics. The laminar flow wing, a design the Germans had experimented with but never perfected for mass production, was a revelation. It was thin, sleek, and designed to reduce drag in a way that made the Focke-Wulf look like a blunt instrument. The engineers marveled at the radiator bath located aft of the cockpit. It used the Meredith effect, where the heated air exiting the radiator actually provided a small amount of jet thrust. It was a level of sophistication they hadn't expected from a rushed design. But the real nightmare for the German high command wasn't just the airframe. It was the marriage of that airframe to the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. When the Germans ran the numbers on the Mustang's range, the atmosphere in the room turned funereal. With drop tanks, this fighter could fly from London to Berlin, fight for 30 minutes, and fly back. The safety zone over the heart of Germany had evaporated overnight. For the German pilots in the cockpits, the technical specifications mattered less than the terrifying reality of combat. Throughout 1943, the Luftwaffe had developed a lethal rhythm for destroying American bomber streams. They would wait for the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings to reach the limit of their range and turn back toward England. Then, the Zerstörer units, heavy, twin-engine fighters like the Bf-110 and Me-410, would move in with massive 30mm cannons and rockets, tearing the B-17s apart at their leisure. It was a slaughterhouse. But in early 1944, during what the Americans called Big Week, the rhythm was shattered. A group of Me-400s and 10s dived toward a formation of flying fortresses near Brunswick, expecting the usual unescorted targets. Instead, they were bounced from above by a squadron of P-51s. The German pilots described the sensation of being hunted by something that simply wouldn't let go. Unlike the P-47, which was a massive juggernaut that relied on diving speed, the Mustang could turn. It could climb, and most importantly, it could stay. Günter Rall, the third highest scoring ace in history, once recalled his first encounter with the Mustang. He described it as a sleek, beautiful bird that moved with an agility that made the Bf-109 feel old and tired. Rall noted that the Mustang pilots were aggressive, often flying hundreds of miles ahead of the bombers to hunt the Luftwaffe on their own airfields. The psychological toll was immense. German pilots, who had once felt like the masters of the sky, now felt like prey. They began to refer to the Mustang as the Indianer, the Indians, who were always lurking in the tall grass of the clouds, ready to strike. The Mustang's impact on German strategy was catastrophic. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, famously remarked that when he saw Mustangs over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. It wasn't just a defeat of machines, it was a defeat of geography. The Mustang had stripped away the Reich's greatest defense, distance. German engineers scrambled to find a counter. They pushed the development of the Focke-Wulf 190 Dora and the TA-152, desperate for a piston-engine fighter that could match the Mustang's performance at 30,000 feet. But for every new German fighter that reached the front, 10 Mustangs were rolling off the assembly lines in California and Texas. The German pilots who survived encounters with the P-51 spoke of its cleanliness. In a dogfight, a Bf-109 would start to vibrate and lose control effectiveness as it approached its structural limits. The Mustang, however, seemed to slide through the air. Its visibility was another point of envy. The Malcolm hood and later the bubble canopy of the P-51D gave the American pilots a 360-degree view of the battlefield. German pilots, trapped behind the heavy steel frames and thick glass of their airlow canopies, often didn't see the Mustang that killed them until the .50 caliber rounds were already tearing through their fuselage. One of the most harrowing accounts comes from a young Luftwaffe recruit who went up against the red tails of the 332nd Fighter Group. He described the Mustangs not just as planes, but as a silver wall. Every time he tried to line up a shot on a bomber, a Mustang was there, forcing him into a defensive spiral. He spoke of the relentless nature of the American pilots, who used the Mustang's incredible fuel capacity to chase German fighters all the way down to the deck, weaving through valleys and around church steeples until the German pilot either crashed or was shot out of the sky. By mid-1944, the German engineering focus shifted toward the miraculous, the jet engine. The Me-262 was supposed to be the Mustang killer. It was nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51, and its 430mm cannons could vaporize a Mustang in a single burst. When the first jets appeared in the sky, the German pilots felt a surge of hope. Finally, they had a weapon that the Americans couldn't touch. But the Mustang pilots were nothing if not adaptable. German engineers watched in frustration as the Mustang pilots developed rat-catching tactics. Knowing the Me-262 was vulnerable during takeoff and landing due to its slow acceleration, the P-51s would loiter over the jet bases at Lechfeld and Rhein. As soon as a jet touched down or began its takeoff roll, the Mustangs would scream down from the clouds. The German pilots, sitting in the most advanced aircraft in the world, were being gunned down by a piston engine plane from the previous generation. It was a humiliating realization. The Mustang was so versatile and its range so great that it could negate even the advantage of jet propulsion through sheer persistence. The engineering post-mortems conducted by the Germans on captured P-51s revealed another uncomfortable truth: the American philosophy of rugged simplicity. While the German aircraft were becoming increasingly complex and difficult to maintain, requiring specialized tools and highly trained mechanics, the Mustang was built for the mass-produced world. Its parts were interchangeable, its systems were accessible, and its pilot ergonomics were superior. A German pilot who sat in a captured Mustang noted that the cockpit felt like a luxury car compared to the cramped, oil-smelling coffin of the Messerschmitt. This comfort meant less pilot fatigue, which in turn meant better performance during the grueling 4-hour missions that were now standard. As the Allied armies squeezed the Reich from both sides, the Mustang's role shifted from escort to Jabbo, the dreaded fighter bomber. For the German soldiers on the ground, the whistling sound of a Mustang's gun ports became the soundtrack of their retreat. They called it the Silent Death. Unlike the roaring radial engine of the Thunderbolt, the Mustang's Merlin engine had a distinctive, high-pitched hum that often wasn't heard until the plane was already pulling out of its strafing run. German logistics were strangled. Trains, trucks, and even horse-drawn wagons were hunted with clinical precision. The German engineers, who had once dreamed of high-altitude interceptors, were now hiding in forests, trying to repair engines while Mustangs circled overhead like vultures. In the final months of the war, the Luftwaffe was a ghost of its former self. The veteran aces were mostly dead or grounded by a lack of fuel. The new recruits, some with only a few dozen hours of flight time, were sent up in Sturm units to ram the bombers in a last act of desperation. But even then, the Mustangs were there. German records from this period are filled with reports of overwhelming fighter opposition. It wasn't uncommon for a single German flight of 4 planes to be intercepted by 40 or 50 Mustangs. To the German pilots, it felt as though the Americans were building Mustangs faster than they could shoot them down. The legendary Adolf Galland, general of the fighters, later wrote about the Mustang with a sense of profound respect. He recognized that the P-51 was the decisive factor in the air war. It wasn't just that it was a good plane, it was that it was the right plane at the right time. It gave the Allies air supremacy, which in turn made the D-Day landings possible and the destruction of the German war machine inevitable. To Galland and his men, the Mustang was the symbol of an industrial and technological power that they simply could not match. Even after the war, the German fascination with the Mustang continued. Former Luftwaffe pilots who were recruited into the new West German Air Force in the 1950s often had the chance to fly the aircraft they had once feared. Their accounts are telling. They spoke of the Mustang's harmonious controls and its honest flight characteristics. They realized that the plane they had viewed through a gun sight was, in fact, one of the greatest flying machines ever created. The story of the P-51 Mustang is usually told as a triumph of American ingenuity and British power. But through the eyes of the Germans, it is a story of a sudden, terrifying shift in the balance of power. It was the machine that turned the sky into a prison for the Luftwaffe. It was the silver ghost that appeared over Berlin when the experts said it was impossible. It was the predator that waited over the jet bases, proving that speed is nothing without the persistence to stay in the fight. For the engineers and the design bureaus of the Third Reich, the Mustang was a humbling lesson in the power of refined simplicity and aerodynamic perfection. For the pilots who faced it, it was a relentless foe that demanded everything they had and usually took more. As the last embers of the war flickered out in May 1945, the sky over Germany was finally quiet. But for those who had flown against the little friends, the silhouette of a P-51 Mustang would forever be etched into their memories. Not as a symbol of liberation, but as the silver-winged messenger of their inevitable defeat. The Mustang didn't just win dogfights. It broke the spirit of an Air Force that had once thought itself invincible. It proved that in the theater of total war, range is the ultimate weapon, and a well-designed wing is worth more than 1,000 desperate prayers. The German perspective reminds us that the true measure of a weapon's greatness is not found in its own records, but in the fear and respect it earns from those who had to fight against it. The P-51 Mustang was, by every account from the other side of the cockpit, the undisputed king of the skies.
If you liked this video, please hit the like and subscribe button for more.